Hey everybody, it's Sam Culper from Forward Observer, and today I want to address something that's very important, which is this whole concept of Civil War II. A lot of people are talking about it. A lot of people have no idea what they're talking about. And I think there's a very accurate model for looking at what we can expect. So let's start with some key assumptions here, which I think are well grounded. Number one, a nationwide civil war, something like coast to coast, in the vein of 1861 is extremely unlikely. I mean, almost to the point of absurdity of even broaching that as a subject. Next, a civil war during good economic times is extremely unlikely. No one fights when they're fat and happy. And, we have NASCAR and Chapo Trap House. And, as long as people have entertainment, these bread and circuses, they can go out and buy a new car or go rack up spending on their credit card or whatever. No one is going to fight in this nationwide civil war. What is more likely than a national or nationwide civil war is a regional conflict. And I'll discuss why that's likely in just a couple minutes. Now, by far the most important thing to understand about what's happening right now is this concept called low-intensity conflict. The Army, the Department of Defense have an entire doctrine called low-intensity conflict, and it is defined as conflict below the threshold of conventional war, but above routine peaceful competition. Now, we've had political warfare in the United States for essentially since we were founded. That's still peaceful competition, though. All right, no one is at war over those things. At least not in the way we would typically define war. Now, conventional war is tanks, planes, bombs. There are no soldiers fighting in the streets. We're not at conventional war. But I don't think anyone in America would say that we are at peace. The only way you could say that America is peaceful right now is by the strict definition of an absence of war, of an absence of conventional war. What I've likened America to right now is a period of, maybe a hot peace. I think we've gone beyond a cold civil war. I think we're, maybe splitting hairs here, but I would say it's a hot peace, which is there has been political violence. There will continue to be political violence, but hostilities, open hostilities have not yet broken out. It's a hot peace. My personal opinion as an intelligence analyst. Let's look into low intensity conflict a little bit deeper here. So low-intensity conflict is marked by, quote, protracted struggles of competing principles and ideologies. So we can look at struggles over race, class, politics, and ideology. That includes these fringe movements of today like revolutionary communist groups, radical anarchist groups, fascist groups, so on and so forth. We are definitely seeing a protracted culture war here with competing principles and ideologies. These cover political topics like private property, who has rights to the fruits of one's labor. It includes taxation, abortion, immigration, lots of other things. Next, low-intensity conflict ranges from subversion to the use of armed force. We're going to talk about many instances of subversion, and we have seen limited use of armed force. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean armed forces like a professional military, but we have seen political violence with firearms. We will talk about that as well. Low-intensity conflict is also marked by, quote, political, economic, informational, and military instruments. And I would add, or paramilitary instruments. We do see political warfare. That's been a baseline behavior since this country was founded. We have seen economic warfare, which is not new, but certain applications are new in the digital age. We continue to see information operations, propaganda, informational warfare, and of course we have paramilitaries because we have essentially political street gangs in existence today. Finally, low-intensity conflict is marked by localized conflicts, localized actions, but it often contains regional and global security implications. A low-intensity conflict in America does have global implications. It will affect our economy, which will affect the global economy, and it also opens up the United States for further exploitation from Russia and China. If you are Russia or you are China, you want the United States out of your backyard or out of your front yard. You want to curb American hegemony around the world. There's no better way to do that than to exploit an ongoing conflict domestically. And that's probably exactly what's going to happen. All right, so let's get into some instances. Now that we've kind of defined and identified what low-intensity conflict is, at least in terms of characteristics, let's look at some very specific instances. So we have political warfare. The soft coup against President Trump is undoubtedly a really great example of political warfare. Democrats paid for intelligence to be gathered and reported as opposition research so that they could remove Trump from office eventually. Mass immigration is a political tool. It's also being politicized. Immigrants overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. Therefore, mass immigration is in the absolute best interest of Democrats. They're doing nothing more than importing more future voters. And then we have a struggle for political dominance. What we are probably looking at are machinations for one-party rule. It's not enough just to trade presidents back and forth every 4 to 8 years. We look at Democrats who want to abolish the Electoral College. We look at their support for amnesty. That's up to 20 million illegals living in the United States. That's 10 plus million voters who are going to overwhelmingly be voting for Democrats. What we're actually looking at here is a maneuver for one-party rule in America. If that's not political warfare, then nothing is. Next, we have economic warfare. So we look at boycotts. We don't like what you say. You have advertisers paying you money for your talk show or news program. Therefore, we are going to go and boycott your advertisers because we don't like what you say and you're stupid. We look at instances where Chase Bank and other financial institutions have dropped accounts based on politics or behavior that they don't necessarily like. They've dropped firearms manufacturers. I'm not saying that is not within their rights to do, but I am saying this is a form of economic warfare because it is politicized. We have the politicization of commerce. We have lots of corporate activism. So, for instance, we can look at Patagonia. I love Patagonia because they make great gear. I've met Yvon Chouinard. I've fished with Yvon Chouinard. He is a guy who really walks the walk in terms of environmentalism. But we can look at Patagonia as a corporation and see that they support Democrats based on environmental policies. When they're spending corporate dollars to further environmental issues, which overwhelmingly benefit one party, that is one example of corporate activism. There's also the Levi Strauss CEO who said, quote, "We're giving our employees time off to make an impact," end quote. He's talking about paying his employees to go attend anti-gun protests. That's an example of corporate activism. We see it in a lot of other areas in terms of corporations supporting a lot of social justice issues. That is corporate activism. And then we have deplatforming, which is economic dislocation. So whenever someone is removed from Patreon, whenever someone gets fired from their job due to this astroturfed outrage, in essence, there are groups that are saying, we want to dislocate you from the economy. We want to limit your economic opportunity. We want to make sure that you have no income. We want to ruin your life because we don't like your political views. There are a lot of other examples of economic warfare. These are just a few. Next, we have information warfare. So there are politicized ads, basically propaganda that appears in advertisements. We have seen lots of selective reporting of the news, like MSNBC. They said, we're not going to report on this story about Harvey Weinstein sexually assaulting all these girls because it is an unpalatable thing for us to do. So whatever guy scooped that story had to go around and shop this story to several outlets before it was finally picked up. We see things that are detrimental to the Democrat cause, examples of corruption among Democrats. We never see that stuff in Democrat media. I watch way more left-wing media than I do right-wing media. I know exactly what they report. I can generally pick up on things that they are not going to report on, even even though we know their producers know about it. And so this selective reporting really is information warfare. There's political messaging in the media, this thing called news analysis, which really should be called opinion. A lot of media outlets do not distinguish between their news reporting and their opinion reporting. And so because those lines are so blurred, a lot of times opinion is viewed as news. That's information warfare. And then finally, we have censorship on social media platforms. We don't like what you say, we're going to get you removed. We're going to limit your ability. We are going to reduce your exposure based on your ideologies. That is also an example of information warfare. And we have political violence, which up to this point has been sporadic. The most high-profile case was the Steve Scalise shooting by a deranged Bernie Sanders supporter. Other Republican representatives were lucky that they were not injured or killed during this shooting. We've seen tons of attacks on Trump supporters. We've also seen shootings at synagogues and mosques and churches, religion-based and race-based. There's tons of politically motivated violence. Political violence is here. It will not end, and it is far likely to worsen before it eventually may get better. So that brings us to where we are on this scale of conventional war to just peaceful, routine competition. You are here. We are right in the middle of this. This gray area right here is called low intensity conflict. We are seeing it. This quote unquote civil war has already started. It is here. That's not to say that it will end in an 1860s style conflict, because I still think that's unlikely, but I do wholeheartedly believe that things will get much worse before they get any better. So as an intelligence analyst, when I look at the future, specifically the future of conflict in this country, I'm looking at three things. It's very important. Having a model to understand, or having a model through which to view pieces of information, is extremely important because it allows us to structure our thinking. So I'm looking at structural fault lines, I'm looking for accelerators, and I am looking ahead, thinking about the future, thinking about potential triggers that can make all these things we're already seeing in this low intensity conflict explode. Let's look at some structural fault lines. There's obviously race. That's been an issue for a long time, will continue to be an issue. There are geographical political differences. People in Central Texas and their desire for what government looks like and their outlook for the country is very different than what people want in, say, coastal California. We have fault lines among class, structured inequality. We're talking about extreme wealth and income inequality. I used to roll my eyes when anyone talked about inequality. I started reading up on it, and I looked at historical conflicts. And if you don't believe that wealth and income inequality are contributing factors to this conflict, then you are wrong. Because inequality breeds discontent and resentment, especially when it's exploited for political causes. That creates anger. That creates conflict. Inequality is absolutely a driver in this conflict. It is a structural fault line that we will continue to have, and that in all likelihood will get worse during this next recession or financial crisis, whether that hits in 2020 or 2021 or sometime later. Next, we have accelerators. So continued mass immigration is causing anger on both sides because one side is trying to stop it, the other side is trying to promote it. One side is violating the rule of law, i.e. sanctuary cities. The other side is trying to maneuver and outlaw sanctuary cities. And so this mass immigration problem, which is a political issue, is accelerating the conflict that we are going to see. Online censorship is another example of an accelerator because the parties who are censored become more retrenched in their beliefs that the other side is conspiring to do them harm or conspiring to gain power over them. Censorship essentially proves to people who believe they are being persecuted that they are being persecuted. And then we have polarizing political policies. Trump is a very polarizing figure. His policies have been very polarizing because we live in a very polarized society. And that polarization, by the way, is evident on both sides of the aisle, because the left is undoubtedly becoming further left. The right is widely perceived as becoming further right. That's backed up by some empirical evidence, and that is also accelerating this conflict. Now we look ahead to potential triggers. So we could have a case of high-profile political violence, such as some assassination. We have the 2020 election. Regardless of who wins, we should all be concerned about a failed or a contested election. So let's say this is unlikely, but this is one example. There are some terrorist attacks at polling places on the morning of election day, and untold numbers of Americans say, I'm not going to vote today because I don't want to be attacked. Or we have a contested election. A couple of states have serious proof of voter fraud or vote tampering, and all of a sudden that state election gets called into question, and those electoral votes remain in the balance, which maybe skews the electoral college. And so we have now a contested election. What are we going to do in that situation? How are we going to respond? That's one concern that I have that is maybe a little more realistic. And then we have the next financial crisis. And I don't like the word collapse, but lots of people use the term economic collapse. And that is also one potential as we look forward into the future over the next couple of years. And yes, something like this, high unemployment, especially high youth unemployment, is a universal indicator of civil unrest. The more youths are unemployed, they think they have no future, they have no hope, they're in their mid-20s or mid-30s, they don't have a job, they live with their parents, they feel disenfranchised, they are angry, and now they have tons of free time on their hands. High youth unemployment will be an accelerator, and I think if this next recession is as bad as a lot of people think, then we could see high youth unemployment and we could see this conflict escalate. So my baseline projection for the future, A, is a continuation of low intensity conflict. We're going to continue seeing all the things we've already seen. It's not going to end. It's much likely to get worse, and it's unlikely to get better. And I think that we are likely to have periods of increased political violence, especially as we near the election. And then as we get closer to the next recession, people are out of work. People are very politically polarized. Blame is going to get thrown around, and we could see political violence as a result. The question is, will there be a trigger large enough for this civil war that a lot of people are talking about? This nationwide, coast-to-coast civil war that I think is pure fantasy. So let me address some specific concerns I have about this video, Civil War II in America, who will win? I think it's gotten like 500,000 views now because there are some very glaring mistakes. Just in terms of analysis, there's some very glaring mistakes that have been made here, and it's important to point them out. So this is one example. This is towards the end of the video. John Mark here, it has this scorecard, which is grossly lopsided. It's extremely inaccurate. There are a lot of points that John Mark failed to consider, and frankly, this analysis right here is so superficial that we cannot take it seriously. It cannot even be a factor in our minds when we begin thinking about what this conflict is going to look like. Here's what John Mark gets very, very wrong. Number one, America is such a diverse country that it defies sweeping generalizations. America is geographically, politically, ideologically diverse, racially, culturally, economically diverse, and generalized statements about a very diverse country will be wrong in many cases. For instance, John Mark generalizes about the military, and that's a difficult thing to do because there are important factors other than how most of the military voted. So yeah, there are good reasons to believe that the military favored President Trump in the 2016 election, but that doesn't mean that a majority are going to favor or much less fight in some revolution or national civil war. There are economic implications, there are ideological and psychological factors that we have to consider, because a vote for Trump does not mean that that individual has some diehard ideology, which is why you can't just say, well, the military mostly voted for Trump, therefore the military would fight on the right-wing side in a revolution. Now, that's not a direct quote, but that was the gist that John Mark and many other people make. And without a full understanding of the military, that analysis is extremely superficial. Now, there are also other things we need to take into consideration, like conditions and sentiment in Western Oregon versus Northern Georgia versus Rhode Island are so widely different. They vary so greatly that they absolutely defy some shared generalization. Those places are so ideologically different that any broad generalization is going to be wrong in many cases. If we're going to look at what a civil war is going to look like, we really have to break it down by region. Politics, race, ethnicity, ideology, human terrain, physical terrain, willingness to get involved, opinions of law enforcement, lots of other particular advantages, all widely vary. And you cannot make sweeping generalizations about a country this diverse. It's a shortcut, it's lazy, and you will be wrong about a great many things in a great many areas if you do make those generalizations. What would be much better is if a video went through and looked at these cultural areas and then broke down the advantages instead of making some sweeping national picture. I applaud anyone's inclination to create some kind of structured thinking here. The problem is that John Mark's matrix is superficial and it's also extremely incomplete. It does not contain a wide enough spectrum of indicators that we would typically look for when we're analyzing a conflict. Now, there's some really great factors that were not considered, like quality of leadership. That's going to matter greatly during a conflict. Knowing how to prosecute a civil war, having some warfighting leadership capability really matters. That's not considered. Quality of troops, operational terrain, military efficiency, appeal of program, ability to communicate or ability to securely communicate, lots of other factors that were not considered. You cannot accurately analyze two sides of a conflict unless you can accurately measure what matters. So John Mark's matrix is extremely incomplete. On the topic of things not being measured, another reason why this is a very simple analysis is because it doesn't portray a specific measurement of anything. The right way to do a matrix like this is to assign points, such as on a scale of 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Actual measurements that are scored according to empirical data is a far better way to accurately measure who has the advantage in any particular factor. And again, I would just point out that these advantages differ so widely, region by region, that the integrity of the entire matrix is questionable at best, even if some generalizations are generally true. Like the moot point of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are extremely unlikely to be used in a conflict like this. Therefore, they're a moot point. He gives each side a tie. I say, why even put that in the matrix anyway? Because it has absolutely no bearing on this conflict. So there are much better ways to analyze a conflict. And I don't mean to be elitist or snobby. I don't mean to be condescending. I don't mean to be arrogant. But this is the inherent problem when you have people who don't understand warfare or conflict opine about warfare or conflict. This is like me, an intelligence analyst, giving my opinion on open heart surgery. I'm not a heart surgeon. No one should listen to me about open heart surgery. That's not to say that people cannot have opinions, but I think this is a really good example of someone who clearly doesn't understand warfare talking about warfare. Now, do I think things will get worse? Yes, they will undoubtedly get worse. Will we end up with millions of Americans fighting each other? I think that's extremely unlikely. I don't think that's going to happen. The only way that millions of Americans are going to rise up and start a revolution nationwide or march on D.C. or try to storm the halls of power is if they have nothing left to lose. Now, I wrote this long article about a lot of specific things that are extremely wrong with that video. The video also didn't take into consideration financial aspects of this conflict. If we do have a civil war or some revolution this large, it's going to cause a stock market crash. We're going to wipe out trillions of dollars in investment value, people's futures, people's livelihoods are going to be obliterated. There are a lot of people who are going to be very angry about what's happening. And so if millions of Americans had nothing left to lose, then we may see some mass uprising like that. But frankly, if we get to the point where millions of Americans have literally nothing left to lose, when there is no downside to going out and committing political violence, then people are going to be way more concerned with their day-to-day survival than with what any government is doing. And I just don't see things getting quite that bad. What's much more likely, however, is a regional conflict. We could see states withdrawing from the Union. We could see potentially a war of secession, and I think that's kind of a little on the extreme end of the spectrum here. But I undoubtedly think we're going to see political exclusion. We're going to see economic sanctioning. We're going to see lawfare the next time a Democrat gets into office. I think the Democrats are going to make a run at cementing one-party rule. They can do that. You abolish the Electoral College, for instance. You grant amnesty to 10 million plus illegal immigrants, and you allow them to bring their families over, and now you have created a permanent imbalance in the electorate. If we have amnesty and those people are distributed to enough states, look, you turn Texas blue, and we live here in Texas, you turn Texas blue, there's not going to be a Republican president. That could be done through amnesty, it could be done through abolishing the Electoral College. Many Democratic presidential candidates are in favor of one or both of those things. So we could easily get to that point within the next decade. Are we going to see a national civil war? No, I think people will say, we live in Texas, we can make our own rules. Up until this point, we had the majority, and I don't think Texans are going to allow their state to be artificially manipulated through amnesty. I think there are some things that we could do in recourse, short of even violence or war. But I think once we get to that point, political leaders at the state level are going to have a far better idea of how to resist that. And maybe it does result in violence one day. But people from Texas aren't going to be in D.C. People from North Carolina are not going to D.C. People in Montana or Idaho or Wyoming are not going to march on D.C. They're going to march within their states, which is why a regional conflict is much more likely than some national revolution where all of a sudden leaders in Washington, D.C. are deposed and they're replaced. And that kind of stuff is just complete fantasy. It's just not going to happen. So I hope you understand more now about low-intensity conflict, the conflict that's actually here. People say, well, that's just the prelude to civil war. No, that is the Civil War. We are already in it. The only thing we are lacking is organized political violence, which could be on the horizon. And once you understand this framework for low-intensity conflict, it's much easier to really understand what we're really more likely to see, which is regional conflict, which is the culture war spilling over into violence within states or regions, and what we're less likely to see, which is some national level civil war where DC gets flopped upside down. If you like these videos, if you want me to make more videos about what I think about the future, if you want me to make more videos about low intensity conflict, if you want me to make more explainer videos on warfare, small scale war, irregular wars, insurgencies, then that's something I can definitely do. Let me know in the comments. If you're not subscribed to this channel, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss these future videos. I appreciate your time. Please leave me questions or comments in the comment section below. I'll get around to reading and answering those, and maybe I'll make a video on your question. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay out front.